Of course, we can't complete a discussion about the election portion of what we're talking about here without talking about democracy. So that's going to be the subject of our next discussion. This conversation will be led by Matt Cohen, senior staff writer at Democracy Docket, which is a leading news platform dedicated to information, analysis, and opinion about voting rights and elections in the courts. He's joined by the Secretary of State from Arizona, Adrian Fontes, Ben Davis, who founded and leads Civic Resolve, a program of the When Collective, and we'll have Barbara Smith-Warner, who's the executive director of the National Vote at Home Institute. That's a national nonprofit that works to promote and expand the use of mailed-out ballots that allow all voters to safely and securely vote at home. So if we could just get everybody back in their seats or go out in the hall if you need to take a quick break, and we're going to move ahead with our next panel, and we will take a break and have Congresswoman Custer when she gets here. So thank you all.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to start this just by acknowledging that, while the results of the election definitely weren't what most people in this room were hoping for, we actually had a fairly smooth election with little problems. I think, everyone on this stage would mostly agree with that. And the state of our elections, they go pretty well, pretty smoothly. We've got this down to a science, and we do it pretty well. But, in 2020, there was a lot that went on. And this is how I know that this election went smoothly. My colleagues and I were really preparing for a repeat of 2020. We track every piece of election litigation. We were gearing up for more conspiracy theories about hacked voting machines, false allegations of mass fraud, contested election results, and a tidal wave of lawsuits, multiple attempts to illegally subvert the election. And none of that really happened. So I think that's a testament to how well our elections are run. Now, they're not without their problems, as we'll get into in a little bit, but I think that is worth a silver lining about this election that's worth acknowledging. Now, about those problems that I mentioned, there are major issues. We know that. Access to the ballot, civic engagement. Throughout this election cycle, my colleagues and I tracked the GOP's massive effort to disenfranchise voters. There were Republican lawmakers in states across the country that were passing legislation to block people from voting. The GOP doubled down on their election litigation strategy. They spent more money than they've ever have before on lawsuits to block people from voting. Just before the election, I put out a piece that that noted that this is the most litigated election on record so far. And that was before the election. Obviously, the results, there were not lawsuits trying to overturn the results, which is good, but there is still, the fact remains that there is this massive right-wing effort to disenfranchise voters. And so, I think that is something that everyone in this room is very much aware of and actively fighting against. And then on top of all of that, election officials, have to grapple with the onslaught of misinformation and disinformation that really sow discord and distrust in our elections. We really saw that in 2020, and it's still a huge problem. Things keep evolving. These threats keep evolving, but despite all that, our systems are working fairly well, and I think this election was a testament to that. And we really do need to keep working to make sure that they work smoothly and that we can protect democracy in these institutions. Of course, this is just kind of my bird's eye view as a voting rights reporter from this. So, I really would like to start this panel and this conversation by asking someone who literally just administered an election and may have a different perspective about what is and isn't working. So Secretary Fontes, I'd love to kick this off. Asking you, from your perspective, how did this election go? How did it compare to 2020 previous elections?
Well, thanks for having me. And thanks to New Deal and all the folks who help pull folks like this together. I've personally found it to be really useful, learning a lot about a lot. And the one thing I know is the more I learn, the more questions that I have. And to answer your question, I think we're doing much better than we were in 2020, but 20 was better than 18, and 18 was better than 16, and so on, because this is a very dynamic and a very evolving space. And I think one of the things that we have to really sort of level set is the scrutiny that election administration has underfallen over the last several years is all based on some significant, focused, and pointed efforts by our foreign adversaries. It doesn't have anything to do with one guy's grievance or all that stuff. And the folks that are out there driving Americans away from one another regarding our politics, they're driven mostly by our foreign adversaries. We have to realize this, and we have to understand this, first and foremost, for two reasons. Number one, when you put yourself in the position of an election administrator, you are outside of the political space, and you have to be objective in analyzing what you're looking at. I don't have the luxury of being a heavy partisan. I can't. The work that we do, however, in the election administration space is done in a lot of ways by partisan elected officials like me. And so we've got to walk that tightrope. How have we done? Better every time. We're more safe, we're more secure, we're more accountable, we're more transparent, far more litigation, I'll give you. We have just gone under the 36 active lawsuit threshold. And we're pushing down towards the 24 active lawsuit threshold. Thank you very much. We're moving there. This is all like very good for the lawyers in Arizona. But when it comes down to it, what you have is a space in government that is the epitome of the way we look at government in the United States of America. I'm going to date myself with this. We want a Yugo, or we want a Cadillac, but we're paying for a Yugo. Right? We want something that is absolutely perfect every single time. We demand perfection, not only in performance, but timing and everything else in between, and we're not paying for it. The election administration is the only space in federal critical infrastructure as designated by the Department of Homeland Security that has no sustained federal funding. Most states don't fund their elections enough, and many states like Arizona leave the bulk of it to the counties. And the counties then have to struggle and find that money. And I'll give you one quick example before we move forward, because it really does come down to resources, human and otherwise, and we've lost a lot of people to threats and stuff. We can get into all that. We're doing well, but we could do better. And the example that I want to give you is this. Our presidential primary, presidential preference election in Arizona happens in March. By statute, they've set a number of dollars per ballot that the counties get reimbursed. There's a lot of county government folks here. You'll relate to this. It doesn't cover half of the cost of the election. And this is an exclusively partisan affair that doesn't allow independents to vote in it. You have to actually designate what party you're going to be in Arizona for the president. So the party infrastructure, both parties, have cost the taxpayers a whole bunch of money. Most of the independent voters cannot vote. The parties decide if their candidates are going to stand for the election, and then the state doesn't cover half of the cost. And we have to do it perfectly every single time. Now, I'm not in county government anymore. I'm at the state. But in spite of these sorts of things, and in spite of that type of an example, I think we're doing really, really well across the entire nation. And if this election is evidence of that, then you can take it to the bank that we've been doing well, because guess what, folks? We haven't changed a lot in the last 10 or 15 years.
You touched on a couple important points that I want to get back to, but I want to hear from our other panelists. Barbara, what do you think this election, from your perspective, how did it go, especially as it relates to kind of mail-in ballots and mail-in voting?
Well, thanks, and thanks again for having me here, New Deal. I'm a former state legislator from Oregon, and so particular shout out to Tobias Reed and Janelle Bynum, both of whom I served with in the legislature, and I'm thrilled to be able to kind of call out their successes and the role I think that New Deal has played in helping to support them in their efforts, and in Oregon. But I work for the National Vote at Home Institute, and what we focus on is voting at home, which most of you probably think of as vote by mail. But what it is, Oregon was the first state to go to a universal vote at home system. 24 years ago, every voter gets automatically mailed a ballot for every election. So in 2020, you may have heard a little bit more about this, right? Faced with the pandemic, all of a sudden, how are we going to do this thing that is such a collective social thing in most states on how people vote? Well, we did a lot of pivoting to voting at home, and it is not a coincidence that more people voted at home in 2020 than any other method. Not a majority, but a plurality, 47%. And the rest of it was split between early in-person voting and election day voting. So what happens? Wow, highest turnout ever. This is going to be transformative. I'm sure this is going to be what we're all going to focus on. Getting more people to vote is what we need to do. Well, instead, 4 years later, we are looking at an election in which turnout is lower, and use of mail balloting is lower as well. Now, we all knew that 2020 was kind of a big bump, but the use continued to increase. But I was really struck by a couple of the folks who were on the earlier panel. Georgia had 27% of their voters voted home in 2020, and only 5% this year. Same thing in almost all of the swing states, the percentage of voting at home. And the thing, and I will wait to talk a little bit more about this, but I guess the thing that I would like all of you to think about is people have mentioned the idea of the need to do foundational changes, right? Well, if voting is the foundation of a democracy, shouldn't we want it to be as easy as possible? And is there anything easier than sending every voter their ballot? It flips the script, right? It makes it so that voting is an opt-out instead of an opt-in. Right now, you as a voter, you have to go find your ballot wherever it is. When we are talking about universal vote at home, which 8 states and DC do, that's some foundational change that really centers the voter in the process and leads to really significantly increased turnout, increased engagement, down ballot, youth voting, traditionally disenfranchised. So I think that we're still working on numbers, but I would say overall, it went very well, and yet I'm really struck. I think it's an important difference that the going away from that voting at home also led to less voting overall.
I want to talk a little bit more about that, especially, there's a shift this year in 2020. The GOP and Donald Trump really attacked mail-in voting, and they changed their tuning, and they really encouraged their base to embrace early mail-in voting. They weren't worried about getting an egg on their face about changing their tune about it. But I'm curious, how did that affect kind of your efforts? And Ben, chime in too. In the access to the ballot. From your perspective, can you talk a little bit about how that affected you?
Yeah. I'll just talk a little bit and let Ben comment on that as well. So again, if you look back at 2020, amazing turnout, high turnout, great use of this, and then you are hit with the 1-2 punch of there is the allegations, the big lie about voter fraud. And after 2020, and voting at home, mail ballots become a target of that. So that enters the kind of the ecosystem and the conversational thing. So that just kind of was pushed out for so long and so extensively that it created doubt among not only their target of the folks who are responsive to that Republican messaging, but also to voters in general. Add to that, people, everybody, all of us who just wanted to get the pandemic behind us, right? We didn't, a lot of what we've done in the last couple of years we take every state where it's at, because you can vote at home in every state in the country, right? It's just a matter of how easy or hard it is. So we do a combination of trying to promote policies that make it easier, and just remind people that it's a great turnout mechanism, period. And so the combination of that kind of that ongoing baseline of, it's fraudulent, it doesn't work, with, that's so 2020, that's so pandemic, that's not a thing anymore. It really had, and I cannot actually tell you the number of times when someone would email me in the last year and a half the notice of, look, Trump supports it now, and then a week later he would say, no, it's a terrible thing, it's fraudulent. So did it have an impact? Yes. What I hope it has is more of an impact going forward, because the truth is, as we have over the last 20 or 30 years increased access to it, back in the 90s, in the early 2000s, it was mostly Republican legislatures that eased up, that made it easier to vote at home, that took away the excuses that were required, right? So it's really only a recent development that it was opposed by Republicans. So I hope that we get back to the foundational truth of it, which is it just increases turnout. It doesn't actually help one side or another. It just makes it easier to vote, and it makes more people vote. So I hope that ends up being a longer term impact.
And Ben, I'd love to hear from you about how mail-in ballots this election affected civic turnout, but more so your sort of point of view of what worked, what didn't work in this election in terms of getting people to the ballot.
I live in Colorado, so our election day is 3 weeks long. It's a great way to go for the folks that have an address where it works. I think we put a lot of pressure on election day to represent everything we are civically and politically, and I think that is a reduction of values and experience that is, I think, very confusing for us in these moments, and I hear a lot of that in the discussions about what just happened. If we're going to reduce civic engagement to the act of voting, then I think we're going to find ourselves in a really hard position as we try to figure out how to build the kind of communities we want, support people the way that we know we can through these public institutions. And I think that we've got to really slow down, maybe know a little less and question a little more, and ask ourselves, what does it mean to be civically engaged? What are the different expressions of that? Because voting is certainly one, and I think reducing barriers to vote, which is something we believe in and fund, is important. I think we just ran the best election in recent history. I think that is very apparent. We knew the results so quickly, and it was accurate and effective. And that's a testament to what we can accomplish if we decide, like we did as a collective philanthropic community in 2020, with all the advocates and partners and experts and county clerks, to say, this system is really brittle. We've got to invest deeply in its leadership and in the capacity with which they have to run our elections. And we need to be in a different place in 4 years. And we are. From where we were in 2020 to where we are today is very different. It's more resilient. It's more updated. We're not using Windows 94 anymore, or at least not in as many places. Still a little work to do there, I think. But we also have to expand our perspective beyond election day and start to ask ourselves, what are the different expressions of civic engagement? It's service, it's belonging to commissions and clubs, it's working in soup kitchens. It's all the things that allow us to connect as humans. And right now we aren't doing that terribly well. Half the country is admitting that they're incredibly lonely. They have no close friends that they would call close friends. We've got, only I think it's a quarter of the average community member participates in their community in any way. We're eating a steady diet of envy on social media platforms. And then we're asking ourselves to go express how we're doing one day every 2 years. That's a little reductive, but I think that is the challenge that I see us facing more and more. And so the question for us is, how do we invest more deeply in the localism that civic engagement actually is and help people find pathways to that? How do we invest in digital town halls that actually allow us to communicate well with each other instead of what we're doing now? I don't think Nextdoor in its current form is the model. How do we have more relevant candidates at the local level so that people have a more personal connection to what's happening? Our entire civic conversation, if you do want to focus on voting, is largely federal. And then we have 70% of these elected seats in the country aren't being contested. And then the folks from these communities that don't feel served by this system and just voted in very large numbers on election day for, I think, something that a lot of the folks in this room would not have asked for. Those folks don't see a relevant candidate locally. They don't feel like they participate in their community locally. And then we ask them to voice how they're doing in a largely national election. I think that's a really tough way to handle the challenges we're facing as people and as a nation.
I think that's a really good point. It's something that I think a lot about in terms of the work that I do covering a lot of these, barriers to the ballot. And a big one is that, because a lot of states have such wonky, weird laws, a lot of people don't really know when they can vote or what they need to do. I mean, a perfect example is in Pennsylvania right now, there's almost 20 lawsuits, trying to challenge certain mail-in ballots because signatures were in the wrong place. And I think, there's really opportunity to sort of parlay civic engagement to more voter and election knowledge and things like that. And I'm curious to know, do you see a connection there?
I mean, I see a connection with the lack of authenticity in how we talk about public life in this country. And I think most voters recognize it too. Somebody described most of the political conversation we just had this last year as largely as pablum. It's just words. It's like common sense solutions. How many times have we had candidates tell us they have common sense solutions? How many candidates in this room feel like they have to say that? Instead of saying what they actually want to say, which is address the actual issues that they know their community is facing and address it in an authentic and meaningful way. And then we go ask people to vote because they feel like they're actually being respected enough to be a part of the conversation. That has to change. We spent $10 billion in political advertising this cycle telling ourselves that we're not the same and we're separate. And then we're going to go have another civic discussion about how to be together in community. That's a really tough proposition to make. And so I think all of this stuff is so intersectional. It's not just voting. It's not just the quality of our candidates. It's not just the parties. It's not any one of these things. They're all informing each other. And I think the more we give ourselves a moment to ask ourselves how they're informing each other and how we can all be contributing in different ways to the future that I think we all want, I think we're going to get to a better place than we are right now, reducing this to who's the next chair of the Democratic Party. That's not the problem.
If I could kind of squeeze it, I think there's a different perspective here that folks on the political left tend to leave out a little bit. Motivated citizens will figure out how to vote. If you're not motivated and we're just kind of expecting people to do it, then voter suppression is I think, more prevalent and higher up on the priority list. But what we're doing is we're assuming, I think, generally speaking, that they're motivated to vote. We're not giving them a reason. We're not attacking with passion. We're not being aggressively normal. We're just expecting that citizens, given the tools, will do it. It's a little bit of a lazy approach, I think, because if you're not motivated, if you haven't been exposed to a reason why to be passionate, then voter suppression is going to win, right? But it was a whole lot of people who were really damn passionate many years ago because they were exposed on why they should be passionate. Because leaders explained to them and showed them from the pulpits, from the lecterns, from the standing on park benches, here's why this matters to you. And we sort of take this very eggheady approach on the political left. Well, we have this, and this affects these people, and this affects those people. It's not about you and your passion and your family. And that to me is, it's really normal for folks to care. But if we kind of just do normal, then yes, voter suppression can win. But there was a lot of voter suppression going on in the 60s and in the 50s. And voters won. Motivated voters won because they had leaders that were pushing and were making sure that there was some passion in what we were doing, right? And so I'm not saying voter suppression should be ignored or deprioritized, but I do think that there's a broader angle that we should be approaching this with vis-a-vis whether or not voter suppression, what kind of impact it actually has. Because look, it's about as easy as pie to vote in Arizona, right? You can get your ballot mailed to you, you can vote early, you can turn it in all the way up to election day in the envelope. Yes, it takes us forever to count our ballots. Fine, get over it. But motivated voters, voters who feel passionate about their vote, I think that's one of the things we're really missing, because a lot of people, like, why in the world is it that we can't figure out how to tell people or just explain to them why they should give a shit? That's where we're losing folks.
Robert Putnam in like the late 80s wrote that book, Bowling Alone. If you all seen the movie on Netflix, it's well worth your time. He was saying then we're going to be doing what we are doing. We're not connecting. Like we're not joining groups. We're not with each other in settings that aren't political, hanging out with each other so that we can then do this better when the time comes to make a vote. I went to my local polling office in Jefferson County, Colorado, and this was at the height of the partisanship and the election, just to see how they were doing. I was curious about the process. And there's a room in there that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with there's like 100 people. They were all Democrats, Republicans, and independents, and they had the colored lanyard. And they weren't allowed to talk politics, but they'd been sitting there opening ballots for the county for the last 6 cycles. You know, the oldest person in the room was 94. They're clearly all from different political persuasions, and they were spending their time just really being with each other. They know about each other's grandchildren and their health issues and all the things. And it was just such a vibrant, beautiful conversation happening in the heart of our democratic process. And it was healthy and normal and viable. Like, that is possible, right? If we can kind of structure these spaces to do that. And then I think the vote, it becomes meaningful because there's passion around being in support of your community. Right now, I don't think any of us feel good about the political conversation we're having, and yet we're just allowing it to happen. And I think that, like, there's got to be a way to shift this. And I think it's take some time and some willingness not to engage the way we do.
I wanted to. I'm going to jump back into it because we were having a really good conversation about civic engagement, and one thing that I've been thinking about from your comments, Ben, is civic engagement. One of the biggest issues we have, the Dem Party has. There's a whole host of voters who are, like you said, Secretary Fontes, not as fired up to vote as they once were. At the same time, there's this sort of onslaught of misinformation and disinformation and various threats that are, trying to get people to not vote. How is that affecting civic engagement, along with, the various messaging problems from the party?
Well, let me agree with Ben first. Civic engagement goes far beyond just voting, right? It's Bible study on a Wednesday evening. It's all of these places where we gather with folks. And so I think first and foremost, we need to recognize that a good civic society requires, Boy Scout and Girl Scout troops, right? It requires PTOs and PTAs across the country that are healthy and all this other sorts of stuff. And before I go on, I want to just compliment the Congresswoman. She's left already. I think she proved my point when she said there was a whole bunch of people who had never voted before in line with their IDs, had no idea what to do. Their votes weren't suppressed. Their votes weren't suppressed. They were motivated to vote beyond the voter suppression tactics, and that, I think, is really important. But again, civic engagement really has to be so much more than just voting and so much more than just politics. And those of us inside of the political bubble have to get rid of that nonsense. We've got to go out into the rest of the world and do the things that so many of us do, particularly on the local level, right? Folks, mayors out there and council members and boards of supervisors and commissioners, you guys get it. And as you move up, I guess, the political food chain, we tend to get closer and closer and closer into this little bubble. I see myself, even from going from being a county official to a state official, I'm kind of in a tight bubble. I'm surrounded, instead of by just 5 members of a board of supervisors that I have to deal with and a couple other county officials, and then the rest of my life, I've got 90 members of a legislature that I've got to think about, right? And a whole bunch of other big statewide stuff that gets filtered through sort of this layer of lobbyists and special interest folks that I'm paying attention to. So I have to be particularly cognizant, and maybe that's where we get to, where we in the political class, because let's be honest, we are in the political class, we need to be honest with ourselves and reach beyond those barriers and get out into the real world. I think that's what's missing. We don't know what civic engagement is because we're not engaged in the rest of civic society, civil society. We're engaged in politics, and we got to get out.
I wanted to mention what that really makes me think about. I agree with civic engagement. Somebody talked on an earlier panel, it came up that we can't just engage with people every 4 years, we need to engage with them every 2 years. I would argue we need to engage with them every day. I have been involved in a number of things. I started out as a legislative and political organizer for labor unions, and I've been involved in a couple different organizations that did just that what their focus was day to day, week to week, month to month engagement with citizens in a community, in a district. And the idea of having it be the idea of the way you create community, it's not just going and talking to people from September to November and thinking you're going to help make them vote. It is creating, go and do a Habitat for Humanity building site. And then the next month you do a bowling tournament. And then the next month you collect gifts for, kids for holidays or whatever it is. The idea of investing in our communities with organizers. I mean, that's of course how I think about it because I'm an organizer, but I've been involved in a couple projects like this. I've pitched this project many times in many different situations. The idea that, I was the caucus leader in Oregon. 20 years before that, I was actually the campaign director for that caucus, and I came out and said, here's what we should do. We need to start right now and hire organizers in all of our swing districts and have them do this kind of community engagement. And I still think I've seen it be done a couple times well. I've seen it be done sometimes not as well. I've seen it not get done many times. But the idea of that level, and we, not one person or one organization can fix all of our lack of civic engagement. But that is a big thing. And I do have to throw in one more thing, that what your point, Adrian, is so good about. We are not normal people, as I call them. We are whether you call us the political class or whatever else, we pay attention, we're engaged. One of the things that I hear the most about people about voting at home is they say, oh, but I love walking to the polling place in November and that beautiful day and the community feeling I get from going there. And I'm like, you're not the problem. The problem is the people who have 2 jobs or have a sick kid or who can't find where their polling place is or there is a weather event. The idea of centering the voter is you give everybody that ballot and they have the option to do that. Great. If you, Mr. I like to walk in the fall guy, you can take your ballot and walk in the fall and take it to your election office and see people in your neighborhood. But we do need to acknowledge that for normal people who have multiple jobs, who have whatever it is, that idea of focusing them, making it easier for them, reducing or eliminating the barriers for them, that is another thing besides motivation that is going to help them to do it.
Yeah, and I think this is a wonderful moment to have that conversation. I mean, okay, we're being given the gift of some space to rethink some things. And I think for, my peers in philanthropy that are focused on civics, the conversation is really, what are we orienting to, and can we orient to something that's 10 years out and start to really invest in that level of change? Because the political system is going to continue to work in its 2- and 4-year cycles, and that's the way it happens. Can we find a way to participate that isn't rooted in that short transaction, but actually offer more value and experience for more people to participate civically so that we're actually a partner to this process instead of a participant? And that, I think, is the moment we're in right now. We can do this. We can advocate to philanthropy to do it, and we can talk to each other about it, and we can just be explicit that if we want our votes to stop being transactional, we need to stop being transactional with voters.
There is a formula for that established by a couple of philanthropists that I think everybody in this room knows. And it started in 2011, and it has had a significant impact on the Latino community. In 2011, the Koch brothers launched the Libre Initiative. And the Libre Initiative is coming into maturity now, 13 years after it started. That's the long-term, not just during elections, constant support of the community outside of the political cycle stuff. Exactly what you've described, there's a footprint out there. And it's had a devastating impact on our side of the aisle's politics.
I think you made a really good point, Ben, that I wanted to just expand on, is that I think this is a really great moment to have the political class get involved in that civic level, because we have this luxury to know that the Trump administration isn't going to be there for these communities. Some of them may not know that, but we know that. And so this is the moment to really kind of meet at that level, to get involved in kind of mutual aid efforts. I'm thinking like, Asheville, just one of my best friends lives in Asheville, just got drinking water for the first time since September. And I was talking to him recently, and he was telling me, I was asking what it was like down there. He's like, the thing that's really interesting to me is that the people that are handing out supplies and food and all that are volunteers in my community. And the police and National Guard or whatever, they're basically protecting grocery stores from being looted. And I think there are like kind of moments like that where, there's an opportunity for the class to really step in and show like, it's not an election year. This is how you civically engage and kind of meet people where they are.
But can I make a quick distinction though? Yeah. And this is gonna be, I know you're looking at me like this is gonna be Fontes being Fontes here, okay? Communities of color don't want handouts, they want opportunities. Communities of color, and I can speak to Latinos in Arizona, to narrow it down. We don't want to be gifted something other than an open path upon which we can walk towards our own destinies and our own futures. This is what we want. And while in times of emergency and in times of need, all people who are in need should help one another. But if we're not talking about opportunity in business and entrepreneurship, opportunity in education, moving forward in medicine, helping people, advance their and protect their families and provide for their families. Jason Kander said it as best as anybody ever said it. Now, y'all know Jason. He said, we want our families happy, healthy, safe, and nearby, and that's about educational opportunities, business opportunities, and good communities. It's not about handouts. And so I would say, and I rarely do this, my people don't want handouts. We want a path for opportunity. We want to understand how systems work so that we can take advantage of them like so many other people have historically. Right, and I think that's one of the things that's one of the reasons why we're losing folks as Democrats. What are we offering communities of color other than handouts? And I know I'm painting with a really broad brush, and I'm perfectly okay if somebody gets offended by that. But at the end of the day, this is wake-up call time, and I think our attitudes have to shift a little bit. We can't look at folks who are downtrodden economically or otherwise and say, "Oh, poor them." We have to look at them and say, how can we help lift them, pick them up without handing something down?
Now, I think I'm glad you made that distinction. That extremely important. I want to take this opportunity to open it up for questions that any of you may have for our panelists, and we can keep this conversation going. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you guys for everything you're saying. And I'm just so glad to be here with you because it's everything you're saying feels exactly like where I was coming to, and I just I'm grateful to sort of hear you saying it out loud. But then also there's the practical side, right? And so I'm in New Hampshire. I'll just use our example. We are a volunteer legislature. A lot of our folks have other jobs. We are slimly staffed. everybody runs for everything every 2 years, so we're constantly just fundraising out of the same little pool. How can we be a part of operationalizing, like building this genuine community in an organic way that's not unrealistic because our resources are slim and isn't contrived because it's organized towards an end? Like, what are just some practical suggestions you guys have? And I know you mentioned like a Habitat for Humanity Day, but I would just welcome your other thoughts on, how do we go about this in a really genuine way? And I come at it from like, I was a local elected official first, and so I have roots in my community. I know a lot of people, and when the organizers come to town every 2 or 4 years, like, I can find people for them because I know people, How can we ensure that that's the work we're doing? Because that's what our country needs, and it will yield results because people will feel connected to us. So anyway, I just welcome your suggestions.
You guys mind if I field this one? So these jobs aren't good jobs. I think we've all experienced this. They don't pay well. They're not staffed well. They're often unpaid. We have on our team at Civic Resolve, one of our teammates is a state representative in New Mexico, and she works really hard, and I'm an employer of a state representative, right? And like, it's a tough proposition for everybody involved, for the representative, for the employer, for the work. We have to change the quality of these elected positions, these public positions, and that is something we're taking on. Our Civic Resolve for the next 6 years is going to be working on understanding how to have that value proposition conversation with both voters and electeds, and also recognizing that if we want quality community members who have the capacity to serve the communities they're trying to represent, we have to change the nature of the positions. There's got to be, first and foremost, better pay. There's got to be support for women and mothers in these positions, because if we want those perspectives, and we need those perspectives on these policy decisions, we need to give them a way to be in the room to do so. The same is true for every other lived experience that we all value and want to see in this diverse conversation about what we need. And so that to me is like job number one. And it's the thing nobody wants to talk about or do, especially in political philanthropy. Like that's just not a conversation that's either easy or a short-term deliverable, which is why, for us, it comes back around to what are we trying to orient to in the long term, and are we willing to put in the work and lose time and again to get to that win that'll actually make that change happen. So I think that's like a very structural answer to your question, but a real one, and it's something that we're working with other funders to actually tackle. And then I also feel like, it's really easy we all work at scale in some way. But what's funny about that is I think it leads us to this idea that every action has to be huge. Because so many of us work in big environments, we think the big environment solution is always the thing. But it truly is. It's 100 interventions happening on a daily basis all day long, and you figure out what you have to contribute and where you have to contribute it, and you do that. And if we all continue to do that and continue to talk to each other and question some of these structures, I think we're going to work our way out of this position and be someplace very different in 4 to 6 years.
And I would just add the idea of that idea of the Habitat for Humanity or whatever it is, right? And particularly like in your caucus meeting, like do brainstorm a bunch of like not quite community service projects, but community service projects and calendar them out. And say, okay, as many people as who can come. New Hampshire, geographically, it's not an overwhelmingly big state, and so you could do it regionally. I mean, to literally have that just be part of which is acknowledging that you have a job, and you're a legislator, and you have a life, and maybe a family, or not maybe a family, you have some version of a family, right? Even acknowledging that, don't kill yourself on it, and at the same time, giving people the opportunity to do this stuff is a gift. Because you feel better because you're doing something, they are seeing results. So that really making that be part of who your caucus is, whatever, whether you're in a legislative caucus, whether you're on a county commission, integrate that into what you do.
Any other questions? Yes, over there.
My name is Sarah Tron-Garriott, and I'm an Iowa State Senator, and all of our polling was based on voter profiles, So I was supposed to win by 5 points, and I won by 24 votes. All of our voter outreach on the doors is based on previous voter history or folks who were registered to vote. My paid media was targeting certain targets within that universe. And so I'm wondering, how do we reach the non-voters who may show up? And how do we make use of the folks who did show up in this, see this as an opportunity to engage with them and educate them and involve them in our political messaging? I can't do any more civic engagement than I already do. My husband would kill me. I mean, I'm at every Eagle Scout ceremony and in the community, and just any opportunity I show up for the opening of an envelope. But it's, like, what are some strategic ways that we can reach out to these folks and make a connection, because I know we were missing those people.
So the fundamental principle I think that's really most important here is you got to start with the absolute basic, right? We want to govern. You cannot govern if you do not win, right? And we've identified the Achilles heel in the political left's political infrastructure, and that is we're paying attention to the same people we've been paying attention to for a really long time and only targeting the voters that we think are going to show up. We're doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Why don't we go find the marketing firm that's selling for that company over there? Why don't we go find the non-political talent that isn't tied to a whole bunch of these contractors that we typically use? Right? Why don't we do that? There was a gentleman over here who talked about like a radical reorganization and radical infrastructure. Why don't we stop doing the same thing over and over again? Right? We have all kinds of talent that want to help us out. I can't tell you how many folks from, media and entertainment that I've met going on around there, but I keep using the same political consultants. And no offense to the political consultants in here, but it's a lot more economically viable for you to sell us as the politicians the same formula you've been selling us. So why don't you shift your formula and help us get elected so we can raise more money to pay you better in the next cycle? There's an economic model, right? See, it's all of us. Look, it's all of us, right? We all have to rethink what we're doing. We got our asses handed to us. And this is the time for us to be able to say, why in the world is it that we had lower turnouts? Why in the world is it that we feel so disconnected? Why in the world is it? And we keep looking and looking and looking, and we're like looking into ourselves and looking into ourselves and looking into ourselves. And it was the pollster who showed us, we're not looking out there. We're not looking out that window. We're looking in here, right? You cannot govern if you do not win. And we cannot win if we keep doing the same thing and listening to the same people over and over again. I bucked my folks really hard the first time I ran because they insisted that there was a study out of Harvard that said that Latino men with facial hair cannot get elected. And I got elected. And I told them that they could pound sand. I actually told them something a little less mixed company worthy. And because this is part of who I am, right? I don't have to go out there and sell myself as a Latino. I just got to show up looking like me. And that's enough, right? And so we've got to use our strengths, but we also have to get outside of our own bubbles, outside of our own. And always, 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 in my view, understand there is governance and then there is campaigning. And I think the president-elect understands that really, really well. We've heard 6 or 7 examples of him saying something that helped him get elected. Do we know what he's going to do? Folks, this is American politics. We're well motivated. We have high moral and ethical standards. I think everybody in this room wants to do what they say that they're going to do. But you can't do it if you don't get elected. And if we don't get elected, people will suffer. And unfortunately, I think we're going to see that unfolding. So we got to kind of rewire ourselves a bit, I think.
I think it's also, when you talk about governing, we elect all of you fantastic leaders into these positions and then remove your ability to communicate or persuade much of anything to anyone, unless you go through a media that's increasingly weak and ineffective, or an email list in an inbox full of political fundraising emails. And then we expect our leaders to lead, go make something different and new happen without being able to persuade or communicate to your audience that you can do it. I think that's an impossible position we're putting so many elected leaders in, especially at the local level, where there's less of a megaphone. I think there's an opportunity to be innovative with how philanthropic support, even political support, can be a partner in communicating to the communities that you serve. One of the things that I worked on in the past was, recognizing that we wanted cities to build more mobility infrastructure and bike infrastructure. We offered cities resources to persuade and communicate to the neighborhoods where their roads would change if the cities would pay for the change in road design. And it was a great partnership because the mayor for the first time felt like he could communicate why, we wanted to remove parking spots and lanes of travel and how that would serve the future of that space. And we felt like we had a partner in him who's going to go do the hard thing. And it led to building 400 miles of bike infrastructure in 5 cities in 2 years because we removed the impossibility of communicating and persuading. And so I think that's another opportunity for a lot of elected leaders to look at what's in their backyard and ask themselves, is there a way to be a partner in a policy change or a service to the community that could actually benefit from outside dollars helping make that value proposition happen?
And I want to add, again, I realize how self-serving this is. Change the way we let people vote. I mean, the difference between literally every person having a ballot in front of them, where it's easier to vote than it is to not vote, because you're reminded when it comes in, right? Think about all the ways that our lives have changed, about the things we do at home now, right? During the pandemic, our kids went to school at home. Many people in here, when you're working from home, you're getting DoorDash, you're buying your groceries, you're buying your things. Let's transition that to voting at home, to putting that in front of everybody. Then you're going to have fewer of those folks. You're going to be able to access. Every one of those people who are supposed non-voters are still going to have a ballot in front of them. And so there's going to be even more motivation to do that broader communication. And I know that we're getting the hook from the back of the room, I think.
Yeah, I was hoping we'd have time for a couple more questions, but unfortunately we ran out of time. Thank you all so much. This was a really, really great, productive conversation, I think.